Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us for our inspiring conversation about exercise and nutrition. As we begin, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge that Laurier's campuses are located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee and Neutral peoples. Perhaps you're joining us from another location, and in that case, I would encourage you to take a moment to honor the Indigenous people who have lived and worked where you reside historically and presently. Acknowledging them reminds us of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work. We recognize, honor, and respect these nations as the traditional stewards of the lands and water. Now, for introductions, my name is Nathan Farrish. I'm a studio consultant for Trainerize over here on the West Coast in Vancouver. I'm also an online health coach and group fitness instructor. I've been a coach for 9 years, and I typically work with men who struggle with the 9-to-5 sedentary behavior. And I hope to bring some of that energy and expertise to our presentation today. So today we're going to begin our event this morning by hearing from our two panelists, and then we will open up to the conversation and questions from the audience. Please feel free to pop your questions into the question box, and I will pose them to our panelists during the Q&A. Now, I'd like to introduce you to our distinguished panelists, Dr. Tom Hazell and Jessica Tucker. There's Tom there. Tom Hazell is an associate professor in Laurier's Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education. His research program aims to better understand how physical activity contributes to the regulation of appetite, its subsequent effects on energy intake, and its overall role in reducing positive energy balance and fat mass. Tom is interested in the potential for exercise to improve energy balance through alterations in appetite regulation and post-exercise metabolism. Also, in my time at Laurier, Dr. Hazell was always known for his energy in class, so I'm sure he's going to be sharing some of that today. Jessie Tucker here completed her Master of Science in Kinesiology at Laurier. Her master's research focused on the role of ovarian hormones in pre versus postmenopausal females. This data provides insight into what role the withdrawal of ovarian hormones plays in appetite regulation, and is important considering exercise interventions are less effective for inducing fat mass loss in females. Jessie continues to pursue nutrition research at York University, and I also hear she's looking for food recommendations in Toronto, so please send those on to her. She's also a strength and conditioning coach and an avid cross-country runner. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over here to Tom, who will share some of his research findings. Tom.
All right, thanks, Nathan. Let me get my screen shared here. I'm assuming everybody can see my screen. Nathan, yes. Can you just give me, okay, perfect. I can only see part of it now that I'm talking. Okay, well, thanks for the invite to the Laurier Alumni Association for the opportunity to come chat about some of our work, and I'll get right to it. So I wanted to start with a little bit of a background into why we think this is important. So this is some data out of the US, so not Canada, but I think the same trends kind of apply. Okay, so here you're going to see the prevalence of obesity on the left graph and the prevalence of severe obesity on the right graph based on BMI. So not perfect, but as you can see, as the numbers get darker through the green, yellow, into the red, and even to the purple, the percentage of individuals who are living with overweight or obesity is increasing. So this was in 1990. As you can see, it's starting to get a little darker through the 2000s into 2010, 2020, and now projections to 2030. And I think where this gets really concerning is clearly the majority of the states are now covered such that they're 35% or higher. So the projections in the US are that by 2030, that at least half the population of the United States will be classified as obese. And that will be over 50% of an individual in a state in 29 of their states. So approximately a quarter of the entire population will have this severe obesity. And I think that's probably very concerning for a lot of factors, healthcare, lifestyle, things like that, life expectancy potentially. Maybe not as bad in Canada, but we face the same risks. And I think that's what we're trying to tackle a little bit with the work we do. So why has this happened? And this is just a small little tidbit, but clearly, depending on your age, I always remember stories my dad used to tell me about getting the portion sizes and the amount, the money that it used to cost for food. But this is a typical, right, like a little fast food meal, which was a lot less calories, a lot smaller than what we get today. As well as this is a figure that I've borrowed from Precision Nutrition, which is an online nutrition coaching company. And all I want to highlight is this dark green bar is daily energy expenditure. Okay. And as technology, both time saving and time wasting technology have increased, the amount of physical activity we've done increased. So if we're moving less and eating more, that becomes problematic, because what happens here is this is a relatively simplistic overview of energy balance, but overall energy intake and energy expenditure need to balance the scale. If energy intake's high, we'll gain weight. If energy expenditure is greater than energy intake, we might lose weight. What we're interested in is how exercise may affect energy intake. And many of you may have tried different weight loss diets or tried focusing on nutrition or tried being more active. And sometimes those are met with less success than anticipated. So one of the things that we're trying to do is understand how exercise affects appetite that may be able to encourage changes in energy intake a little bit easier. So a quick little intro into appetite and energy intake. The decision to eat food is complex. And at any point in this talk, I don't mean to minimize the significance of both psychological and environmental cues. So you can think about food. You can go to social situations where food is in front of you. You know, you're thinking Christmas meals, Thanksgiving, going to dinner parties with friends. And environmental is the fact that there's vending machines and fast food places and convenience stores all over the place that make our access and our decision to eat food relatively easy. But what we're interested in my research lab here at Laurier is the physiological component. So there is signals released from the periphery of the gastrointestinal tract or within the gastrointestinal tract that then alter our perceptions of appetite and eventually our decision to eat. So we term this the regulation of energy balance, where there's afferent peripheral signals or hormones that are released that can have both a little bit of a word thing here, but appetite stimulating, which makes you hungry, are called orexigenic, and appetite inhibiting, which make you feel full or less hungry, are anorexigenic. So these peripheral hormones are released when we eat, when we don't eat, maybe when we exercise, that then go to specific regions in the brain that are integrated, that then send responses back to different areas in the body with a response. Okay, and that's where we get behavior change. So looking at this a little more specifically, there are two major regions of the gastrointestinal tract that we are interested in. One is the stomach, and the other is the intestine, and they release specific hormones. We're only going to tackle a couple today. One that you may have heard of is ghrelin, or more specifically, acylated ghrelin, okay, which is the active form of ghrelin, and ghrelin's known as the hunger hormone. Okay, so when ghrelin is released, an increased circulating ghrelin will travel to the brain in a specific region called the arcuate nucleus, which will then generate an increase in hunger. So that orexigenic stimulus, or we have pancreatic polypeptide, peptide tyrosine, which is PYY, or glucagon-like peptide 1 or GLP-1, which are satiety-inducing hormones, or these anorexigenic stimulus. They all travel to the specific area of the hypothalamus known as the arcuate nucleus. So the basic idea here is these hormones are released upon feeding or not feeding, exercise, and they actually generate our behavior and whether we are hungry or not hungry. Okay, so these hormones play an important role in this appetite regulation. In terms of research, there's ample evidence. This is a meta-analysis conducted about almost a decade ago that linked acute exercise to these specific hormones, as well as acute exercise to the actual subsequent energy intake. The only issue here is that in exercise physiology, not all exercise is the same. And we have to be very cognizant of the key details of each exercise session in order to understand how exercise affects appetite. Okay, so I've got a schematic here where I'm hoping to show you what a low intensity, moderate intensity into higher intensity efforts. And I know a little more acronyms here, but HIIT, and I'll show you in a second, will stand for high intensity interval training, and SIT stands for sprint interval training. They're just different kinds of intense exercise. So if you look at the graph here, there's power output or effort on the y-axis, if you will, and exercise time on the x-axis. And you have VO2 peak, which is just an estimate of how hard we can work using aerobic metabolism. Okay, so here's a low intensity session, and then a moderate intensity session. So the low intensity session might be something like walking. The moderate intensity session might be something like a light jog or an okay jog. Okay, and those are done at intensities well below difficult or well below our max, but have to be done for longer periods of time in order to attain benefits. When we move into something like high intensity interval training, as you'll see here, this is a specific form of interval training that's been studied, but there are a variety of different paradigms, but it's 1 minute at an intensity around 90% of your full effort, okay, or 90% of your heart rate max with a 1 minute rest. So you repeat that 10 times. So you'll have 10 1-minute efforts with 10 1-minute rest periods where you're doing nothing, very low activity, maybe like walking around, but they're fairly intense efforts, very close to your VO2 peak. And then finally, the other one that we've looked at in the lab is something called sprint interval training. And what I'm suggesting here, these are literally 30-second sprints. So that's something where you're going all out for as hard as you can go for those entire 30-second efforts with about 4 minutes of rest in between. So the idea here is maybe many people are more familiar with these lower intensity continuous protocols, but there's been lots of interest for a variety of reasons in the health benefits, the body composition benefits, and certainly in our lab, the appetite benefits with these higher intensity protocols. So one of my first tasks when I got a job here I came from the University of Lethbridge in Alberta. I'm originally from Ontario, but this is my colleague, Dr. Jennifer Copeland, and her and I, with a couple of my grad students at Laurier, wrote a review paper on the role of exercise intensity on appetite regulation. So what we were interested in is not that exercise affects appetite. We were interested in how exercise affects appetite. So we came up with some really interesting potential mechanisms. Not many had been supported by research, though maybe indirectly. And only I'm going to talk to you about a couple today. Lactate specifically, though I'm happy to talk about some research we've done with inflammation or glucose and insulin, systematically trying to tackle whether or not these specific and others maybe contribute to how exercise is linked to our exercise response. Okay, so those three are just highlighted there. And Jesse's going to talk to you a little bit about ovarian hormones. So this was one of the first papers out of my lab when I came here. So this is Hashim Islam, who was a master's student at the time, is now finished his PhD and is a postdoctoral fellow out in BC at the University of British Columbia, Okanagan. This is a paper we published that I think was really interesting to show that we had eight healthy males, sorry, that meant to come up, that were recreationally active and normal weight. And they did 4 experimental sessions, okay? So they did a control, no exercise session. They did a moderate intensity continuous training session, so 30 minutes at 65% VO2 max. So an exercise session where you can talk, but you're going to generate a sweat and an increase in heart rate. It's not easy, but not hard. And then they did a 30-minute vigorous intensity continuous training session where they were working about as hard as they could sustain for 30 minutes. Okay, so that one will be a hard one. And then they did this sprint interval training, which has elements of being very, very difficult. So those 4 by 30-second all-out sprints with 4 minutes rest. And what we did was we measured blood samples and appetite perceptions, both before and at different time points post-exercise or post-treatment here, right? Where we measured lactate and the appetite hormones, appetite perceptions, and energy intake. So I'm going to walk you through some graphs now that I think are important to highlight the data. So this is the change in acylated ghrelin, or that hunger hormone. So on the y-axis, we have the ghrelin concentrations. On the x-axis, we have those time points. And all I want to highlight here is control are the open circles with a solid line. So as you go from the pre-exercise time point, ghrelin's going up, longer away from a meal, getting hungrier, okay? And the 2 intense efforts actually suppressed acylated ghrelin or reduced its concentrations, signifying that they should be less hungry. That moderate intensity session basically plateaued it for a little bit, and then it was followed by an increase. So the moderate intensity continuous training had very little effect on this. The 2 intense or more intense efforts had important effects. Here is the change in blood lactate, which was tying mechanism to response. And certainly the sprint interval training had significant increase in lactate, but so did that vigorous intensity. The other 2, the control clearly with no exercise, or the moderate intensity, did nothing to lactate. Here is overall appetite. And I think that you'll see at least that these values or these trends track the ghrelin. So the two intense efforts decreased appetite, the other ones increased appetite as time went on. And then the energy intake was actually suppressed significantly in the sit, but maybe practically important in this vigorous intensity session. So they ate less the rest of the day doing these more intense stimuli. We've followed this up with several different studies. I've only had time to share with you one, happy to chat more, but I wanted to highlight that we had the opportunity when the pandemic hit. Seth McCarthy is a third year PhD, excuse me, in my lab right now, had an opportunity to summarize some of our recent work on lactate as a specific mechanism in a really good quality journal, the American Journal of Physiology. And we highlighted specific mechanisms. I don't want to talk about those specifically, but he is following that up with some work where we actually think we've probably shown now, I think, fairly convincing evidence that lactate is a mechanism involved in exercise-induced appetite suppression, but we're still doing more. And happy to chat in the Q&A about some other ones. I only have time for this, but I will now pass it over to Jesse to talk a little bit more about the potential sex differences in ovarian hormones.
Perfect. Thank you so much for that, Tom. That was awesome. I was, as Tom had said, extremely interested going into my master's in the sexually divergent response to exercise, specifically the female response. So a lot of what my master's was focused on, and we looked at this particular study a decent amount. This group back in 2003 had 74 young and overweight males and females complete a 16-month supervised exercise regime. It was 5 days per week, 45 minutes per day at 60 to 75% heart rate reserve. The target was about 400 calories per session. And when we look at the results of this, we see that the males, which is this graph on the left-hand side, on average lost about 5 kilograms. Where females gained about 0.5 kilogram. So for some reason, something happened where males had a different response to females. And when you think about what that difference could be, we immediately jump to the menstrual cycle and ovarian hormone. So this here is an image of the menstrual cycle, which is characterized by a 28-day cyclical fluctuation of the key ovarian hormones, namely estradiol, which is that light purple line, and progesterone, which is a little bit darker. And we can kind of divide it into 3 phases. So the first half of the cycle, the follicular phase, the first, when menstruation begins to about day 11 or day 12, both ovarian hormones remain fairly low. As we reach the ovulation phase, which is about a 2-day period in between the 2 larger phases, we have a peak in estradiol before it decreases and then increases again ever so slightly, but to a lesser extent in the luteal phase of the cycle, which is the second 12 to 14 days or so. Progesterone, as I said, had remained low throughout the follicular and ovulation, and then increased to a greater extent than estradiol in the luteal phase. And when we look at food intake, we can see that during the ovulation phase, in comparison to the follicular phase, food intake decreases, and food intake then increases in the luteal phase in comparison to the follicular phase. So what this leads us to believe is that there's something going on with ovarian hormones that potentially alters appetite. And that was a lot of my master's work. And I was interested in how this then affected the response to exercise. So we have had previous work done in our lab that has focused on this. This was a master's student, her name's Sarah. She was here in 2019, and she had 12 healthy active females complete 2 vigorous intensity continuous sessions. So that's at 30 minutes at 80% VO2 max in both of the major 2 phases of the menstrual cycle. So that's the first phase, which is the follicular phase when there are low ovarian hormone concentrations, and then in luteal phase, which where we have high ovarian hormone concentrations. So we wanted to see how the appetite response changed depending on the phase of the menstrual cycle. So we can see here that the acylated ghrelin response, which is that first graph on the left-hand side, there was less exercise-induced appetite suppression. So acylated ghrelin was higher in the luteal phase, especially at that 90-minute mark, in comparison to the follicular phase. And that's reflected in that next graph on the right-hand side graph B there, which is the area under the curve that represents the change in acylated ghrelin. So again, ghrelin being the appetite stimulating hormone. So they were hungrier, essentially, is what we think in the luteal phase in comparison to the follicular phase when those ovarian hormones are present. And this was also reflected in energy intake. So we see that when we measured their energy intake, they consumed more food on the day of the exercise session in the luteal phase in comparison to the follicular phase. But the thing is that there isn't much research to back this up yet. And a lot of exercise physiology research is in males. And I wanted to look at a population that was female, but perhaps lacked the menstrual cycle, because then that way you're eliminating any biological differences between males and females and isolating a little bit more that affected the ovarian hormone. So we compared pre and postmenopausal females. So postmenopausal females are essentially 12 months without a menstrual cycle, as well as low hormonal concentrations of estradiol and progesterone. So we're currently in preparation for submitting this research, but essentially what I did is I recruited 8 premenopausal females who were healthy, eumenarrheic, meaning they had a regular menstrual cycle of about 28 to 35 days, were not on any oral contraceptives. We determined their menstrual phase. We wanted them to be in that luteal phase where ovarian hormones were present. So we did that through an ovulation kit, body temperature, as well as a menstrual history questionnaire. Also recruited postmenopausal females who were healthy, had no experience with hormonal replacement therapy, no bilateral oophorectomy, which means both of their ovaries were intact. Their estradiol concentration was less than 50 picograms per milliliter, which was confirmed with our blood samples. And they had an absence of menses of greater than 12 months. So what we did for the session is we had in each group, they arrived at approximately 8 a.m. They received a test meal, and following digestion, they completed a high intensity interval training session. So this session was 20 minutes in total, 1 minute on, 1 minute off using the treadmill, reaching 90% heart rate max in those intervals. So we measured blood samples at 5 different time points. We're going to be focusing on 4 of them. The fasted time point was more so used to confirm estradiol and progesterone concentrations. And then we also measured right before exercise, immediately upon completion of exercise, 30 minutes following exercise, and then 90 minutes. At that same time, we also did a visual analog scale. So we measured their subjective appetite. So they were able to measure essentially on a survey how they were feeling to look both at physiological and psychological components of appetite. So when we look at the results, again, looking at acylated ghrelin on this left-hand side here, we saw essentially very similar things to what we saw with Sarah's. In the presence of ovarian hormones, with the premenopausal females, we saw higher acylated ghrelin. So once again, less exercise-induced appetite suppression in premenopausal females in comparison to post. And again, acylated ghrelin being our appetite stimulating. When we look at our appetite inhibiting hormones, we didn't see much of a change. The only thing you may notice is GLP-1, which is that second graph down below. On the 90-minute point, you'll see some symbols there. Essentially, that just means that as we moved further away from feeding, this concentration of these hormones dropped, which makes sense because the further you move from feeding, naturally, the hungrier you'll be. But we didn't see any differences between groups. When we look at overall appetite, so this was our subjective appetite. Once again, we didn't see any differences between groups, but appetite did increase as the session went on, which is as to be expected. When we look at lactate, which is something we also investigate, we saw that postmenopausal females generated more lactate in comparison to premenopausal females. However, still fairly low absolute concentrations compared to what we have or possibly could have seen. And then when we look at energy intake, we see that there was a greater energy intake on the day of exercise in both groups, but again, no difference between groups. So we're really only seeing the difference in acylated ghrelin. So to conclude a little bit, we're going to essentially, there was exercise-induced appetite suppression in the presence of ovarian hormones. And this supports what Sarah, who was this master's student, had talked about. There was minimal differences in anorexigenic or appetite inhibiting hormones, which is again in line with our previous work and suggests to us that maybe only ghrelin is the only hormone that's relevant for this exercise response. And finally, when we take a peek at lactate, which Tom had talked a little bit about, we saw lower ghrelin in postmenopausal females where lactate was higher, which is again supports our work that possibly lactate is a mechanism behind this exercise-induced appetite suppression. However, it is important to keep in mind that the lack of any other differences could have been the result, as I mentioned, we didn't see as much lactate accumulation as maybe we were expecting. And so that could have been part of the reason we didn't see any other differences. And I also would like to note that our participants' energy intake was low, what we recorded. And so whether they were in an energy deficit, meaning they were consuming less than they were burning, essentially, how that impacts appetite, we don't know. And so it's something to explore further, definitely. At this point, both Tom and I are happy to talk about any questions. I'd like to thank you all for being here. Definitely something I'm passionate about. So thank you so much for having us.
That's great. Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, and again, thanks for everybody who's sharing their questions already. We're going to get to those in just a second here, but please use this time now to post some questions in the Q&A. I think, why don't we keep it rolling here, Jess, with some of the menopausal questions that we have in the chat, since you're on a roll there. So I had one from Cheryl here that said, what age is young? Have you considered focusing on perimenopausal and postmenopausal population groups? I guess we kind of addressed that as we went, but if you want to address that.
Absolutely. It's a good thought, because actually when we were designing the project, it was, what's like trying to characterize a little bit more by age, what is young versus what is old. It has come up previously. Essentially, we just try to use biological age, and the average age of menopause is 51. And so I try not to use words like young and old, so to say. The perimenopausal part of it is really interesting because, to be honest, I don't know that much about it at this point. I'd love to explore it more. What I do know about it is that ovarian hormone fluctuations are just a little bit less predictable, because at that point you're having a menstrual cycle every 3 or 4 months or so. And so you're getting these random peaks possibly of estradiol and progesterone that may not be considered regular. So you almost be maybe equating that to somebody who's premenopausal, but just with an irregular cycle. So for us, that would definitely be a lot more challenging to look at, but it is a really good thought. It's interesting. When recruiting, it's why we use, one of the first question I asked my postmenopausal females was always, has it been a year since your last menstrual cycle? And the answer was always yes. If not, if they get a period every 3 to 4 months, then unfortunately they didn't qualify for this, just because it is so hard to predict what these hormones are doing. But if we were to take blood samples and look at what exactly those concentrations were and try and make any correlations between what the appetite hormones were doing, it could actually be a really interesting study.
Yeah, that's great. We'll flip it over to you there, Tom. John had a couple questions here. First and foremost, how do we decide what's a maximum heart rate? And then from that knowledge, if your heart rate gets up to 90% of your max and stays there for, say, 10 minutes, does that mean that you've done high intensity exercise? Maybe we can classify HIIT.
Yeah, sure. So what we would normally do is we actually had everybody do a max VO2 max test, or a maximal oxygen consumption test, which is a graded treadmill test in these cases where people would work and go until they couldn't go anymore. So we would actually know what their maximum heart rate was. But if you want a quick tip, it's 220 minus your age. So on average, you lose about 1 beat per minute, though some of you are probably screaming at me right now saying, my heart rate can get higher than that. I know, I just ran a marathon in October and my heart rate was well above my age predicted max. It's just a gauge. So when we do this, if you are exercise intensity, heart rate, VO2, or the energy you're burning, those are all linear relationships, right? So as exercise intensity goes up, heart rate's going to go up. Your decision on how hard it feels is going up. Yes. So high intensity exercise would be classified at anything really above 80% VO2 max, which is going to be in that 85 to 90% heart rate range. So these high intensity interval training sessions are not easy, but the benefit is you have short periods of high intensity exercise or intense activity with small amounts of rest. So they're not a grind. That vigorous intensity session that was 30 minutes at 80% or 85% VO2 max is very, very, very hard. But we've had some success doing these interval training sessions in in people who are, well into their 50s. And I think there's some data to suggest that could even be beneficial. Intensity is not something to be scared of as long as you're cleared to exercise by your family doctor.
Yeah, and on that note, I just find anecdotally with my clients that oftentimes, as you said, people are afraid of a challenge or stress sometimes. And I think it's important to remember that the body is very resilient. And in fact, some stress is good stress. You need a little bit of that in order to challenge your body to adapt. So,
and just one thing to add, I get this. I don't want to make this an interval training talk. I always have to do. There have been stuff in cardiovascular disease patients, heart transplant patients, where interval training is as, if not more effective than traditional moderate intensity stuff. So I think, don't think about high intensity exercises doing it continuously. You have these peaks and valleys, right? If you're interested in trying it, I'd highly recommend. I do all sorts of different kinds of exercise, and interval training is one of them. And I'm not what we classify as young anymore either, which kind of grinds my gears, but.
Fair enough. Jess, I'm going to throw it back to you. Question was, does your research touch on menstruators who are on hormonal birth control, or is this something you'd be looking at researching in the future?
Yeah, so actually we had a slide for this at some point, and then it went a little bit, we were looking at, the presentation that was too long. Mine, I excluded individuals who were on hormonal birth control. At the time that I was collecting this data, this would have happened last year, we were in the midst of finishing up another study that was going on in our lab that just compared the appetite response in individuals who were on hormonal birth control. And we found that there wasn't really much of a difference between those who were on birth control and those who weren't in our appetite hormones. But so it's something that I didn't necessarily look at. It's looking right now that it's the presence of ovarian hormones versus not the presence. So right now, whether that's through birth control or through not like just naturally cycling females, whether that makes a difference. I mean, there's always more research that can confirm that, but from what we've seen in our studies so far, then we haven't seen a difference. And Tom, feel free to add to that. This was a student who was there when I was not in the lab, but we just kind of looked at this research over the past year, I guess, since we started analyzing my master's work.
Yeah, I'll just add, COVID has been a bit of a pain for everybody, research lab included. We've been trying to do some research on specific kinds of birth control. I understand there are lots of different kinds of contraception. There's now IUDs and all sorts of things. What we're very interested in moving forward is still, the natural cycling of hormones was the first thing we wanted to tackle to see if they were involved. And now, at least in our hands, it seems like they're involved. So now the next steps will be to tackle whether synthetic versions of those hormones factor in. So might even be looking at exercise responses to a monophasic versus a triphasic birth control and IUDs and things like that. So yes, we will look into it. But this research does take some time, and certainly trying to find individuals to participate in these studies to do the exercise and beyond these specific forms or not forms of birth control has been challenging.
Fair enough. I'm going to flip one over to, I think, here, let's look at this first one. Does a person with autoimmune condition like type 1 diabetes or celiac impact exercise and appetite? I feel like Dr. Hazell, I don't know if you want to take that. But...
Great question. Short answer is I don't know. Not any evidence that I can recall that would say yes or no. My educated guess is no. My educated guess is that these exercise appetite responses would be intact because the celiac or the type 1 diabetes isn't affecting these hormones, right? Your type 1 diabetes is affecting, it's an autoimmune issue, obviously, it's affecting the pancreas's release of insulin. I'm not aware that it's affecting, the stomach lining where ghrelin's coming from, or the small intestine where these other hormones are coming from. And again, there are more. These are just the ones that we've seen respond to exercise. So I'll keep it brief, but I will say it's a great question, and stay tuned, because I think certainly more research going on in these specific issue. What about the inflammation? I said inflammation might be involved, and there's Crohn's and there's inflammatory bowel syndrome. There's lots of stuff that we need to do and not just my lab specifically. I think the area has really kind of grown. This really started observational, and I hope what you can appreciate about the work that we were trying to show you today is that we have moved beyond looking at the response to trying to understand the response.
Awesome. I have a couple questions that are linked here around senior populations. So the first one being, have there been any studies of active people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, and the effects of exercise on hunger suppression? And then a real life example with Andrew here, who's a 78-year-old male who does HIIT and sit type workouts 5 days a week at CrossFit. Kudos to you, Andrew. I know those are hard workouts. And he was wondering do we think that age may change the idea that lactate may reduce hunger? So I guess if you want to speak to that population, that'd be great.
Yeah, so Jesse found that little tidbit where we actually think, based on Jesse's data, that lactate generation might be reduced in older individuals, but that is not something that we have had a chance to continue. So do I think that lactate's less important in terms of appetite suppression, or exercise is less effective when done the way I think it needs to be done? And again, if you're sitting here being like, there's no way that I'm going to do those kinds of workouts, remember, these are all relative to your fitness level. So what might look like an intense interval to a 20-year-old might be very different, obviously, though 78-year-old doing CrossFit, you probably kick my butt in the gym. But I think they're intact. I think it's just a matter of what we have to do to generate. So these individuals, so Jesse had the older group actually generated more lactate, but it still wasn't a lot. So whether we can get them to generate more lactate, we need to figure out. But I still think they're intact, but there has not been enough work in older adults. And I'm talking anything out of recreationally active university students, to be honest. Some stuff in obesity, we've done some stuff in those populations where, excess fat mass loss is important. So great question, great thought, don't know.
Gotcha. All right, some more general ones here that are probably quick hits. Could you please tell me the statistical p-value? I'm not sure which we're referring to. I might leave that to a written one. I don't know if you guys remember though.
The p-value that we tend to use is 0.05, but it was never meant to be a dichotomous variable. This is something that I attack all the time. So in a couple of the studies that I didn't present, the p-value sometimes we use less than 0.1. But we also calculate effect sizes. So we calculate the magnitude of effect. So all these that we were showing and we're saying important differences would be less than 0.05.
Great. And another one, I might have missed this, but is the appetite inducing feeling you studied what we feel in our stomach rather than feelings in our mind that we need to eat?
Well, I think those things are linked. Your stomach doesn't feel anything, right? It's the perception of what your brain is doing about what your stomach. So these are all links from the periphery to the brain. The brain is what tells you whether you're hungry or not. It's perceiving that information from the body, right? So I think those are linked, but certainly we have an inability to regulate that accurately. So think about how easy it is for you to overeat, how easy it is for our society to overeat. I always tell this story in class, and you're gonna laugh at me. The one I always say is KFC. I don't love eating KFC, but I love that smell. I could be full and I could smell KFC and I'd be hungry again. So again, it's the brain thinking about all the different things you get, the reward, the taste, the fun, all those things that come with eating. So again, we're looking at one component of this, though we are measuring some real life aspects, right? Like the energy intake is not, they're on their own, they're writing down what they eat. We could talk about whether there are some potential issues with that, but those perceptions are only part driven by these physiological components as well. So it's really hard to get human behavior in these.
Yes, I'm gonna have a question for you here. In the luteal phase, if we ate less, even though we're hungrier, would this help to lose or control weight?
That's a loaded question. I don't know, because it really depends at that point. Like losing weight, ultimately we talk about a lot, and there are a lot of different theories behind this, and people might argue it, and that's okay if you have different views on it. It's calories in, calories out, and so essentially like to if you were to put it to an equation, that's what it would be. In terms of how, if you burn more during the luteal phase, it's a good question. I don't actually know the answer to that question. It'd have to do, I mean, like I do know that during the luteal phase you do experience an increase in body temperature. Again, how that, but when you look at like the thermic effect of food and body and temperature regulation and basal metabolic rate and all these components going into energy expenditure, how the ovarian hormones would influence these things would be interesting to look at. I don't know the answer to this, and I think I saw another Q&A question kind of allude to this too, as I was going through, asking about what do like specifically postmenopausal females have to, what do you have to do to lose weight? It just really, it comes down to the equation, to calories in, calories out, in my mind. Again, lots of different theories to present that. It's something to consider, and how that relates to appetite. I guess like for me, what the takeaway that I get from this is okay, if you're aware of these things and you know what's going on in terms of your appetite response to exercise, then how can you tweak that to help you reach those goals if that's what you need to do? In terms of, I guess that's a major takeaway. But it's something to look at. It's a great question.
I definitely want to jump on that one. And while we simplify it to calories in, calories out, I don't think it's that simple. So I'm going to disagree a little bit with Jesse. And what I mean by that is that it comes down to obviously the food we're putting in our mouth, but that energy expenditure has a variety of different components. So there is some pretty interesting evidence that suggests that if you get more active, or if you eat less than you need, that your actual amount of energy that you expend for given activities will go down. So the problem with this whole situation, and which is why everybody loves weight loss, is because our body defends the body weight we get to. We're evolution. We didn't know we were going to get our next meal. And we are really good at storing. And we are really not good at breaking down those stores. So what do you have to do specific to the luteal phase? Our hypothesis is that women biologically defend a negative energy balance in that luteal phase to support a pregnancy, whether you are trying to get pregnant or not. You release that egg, and these hormones that are involved, and there are other hormones involved in the menstrual cycle, but specific to appetite, might be that there might need to be a specific target that you need to hit in that luteal phase. Whether that's a different exercise or a different energy intake target, that's the question. So our data might suggest that maybe when there are periods of time that you should exercise a little more intense, because that might help you eat less and not gain back that. But at the end of the day, Jesse is right that the target is trying to expend or eat a little less, right? There's no denying that if we were to cut calories or exercise appropriately, we can probably improve body composition, right? Look at things like The Biggest Loser and gastric bypass surgery and things like that. They're designed to challenge that energy balance equation. But I think it's a huge, by no means are Jesse and I trying to simplify it to say that if you eat less or move more, you will lose weight. It is very complex. And what we're trying to do is find a way. Exercise has so many benefits that I actually don't want you guys to leave thinking weight loss should be a target. I could tell you today that if you exercise the way I tell you, the way Nathan tells you, that we will improve fitness, we will improve mental health, we will improve strength, we will improve decreasing cardiovascular risk, comorbidities, to all sorts of things that exercise can do. And if you do that appropriately over time, then weight loss might come. We also haven't talked about resistance training at all. I'm a massive proponent of lifting weights and trying to build fat-free mass or lean mass that may then contribute. And we've got some data we have to analyze the hormones. But this is a really, really interesting area that I mean, obviously you guys are here because you might have been interested in it, but.
Can I also add another thought just on top of this while we're spiraling, because it's so interesting and fascinating? Is that okay with you, Nathan? Cool. Yeah, because I also, just like in terms of what Tom was saying in regards to like luteal and the follicular phase, I have read a few things that during the luteal phase, as I mentioned, you get an increase in, or during ovulation into the luteal phase, I should say, you get an increase in body temperature. There is some stuff to say that it also increases resting heart rate ever so slightly, as well as breathing rate, which makes exercise feel harder. And so for individuals trying to do that during the luteal phase, and it goes back to the idea of defending this, essentially your body and your body's weight to support a pregnancy. And I believe that's more likely the result of progesterone, but that's again what the research is showing, and that might be a bold statement for me to be making, but that's just based on what I've read.
Yeah, so you can make that in 4 years when you're finished your PhD.
Yeah, right. Yeah, I'll make that statement a little stronger then. That's just what my thoughts are, but it's a great point, because if it feels harder during the luteal phase, then it's just more evidence that ovarian hormones are definitely involved. And Tom's 1000% right. It's way more complicated than just energy and energy.
Yeah, and maybe again, this is Jesse's eye back and forth, but the idea too that I think most people are prescribed exercise that's moderate intensity. And I think what happens is that's where we find the appetite response is variable. So if you do exercise and you expend X calories, but you're not generating any suppression, then maybe your eating habits can compensate perhaps, or not sustain that negative energy balance. But if you were to think about doing it a little more intensely, there are other benefits, but maybe one of them is you might eat less and help with that. And there's some evidence that interval training may be more effective to body composition improvements than moderate intensity. So I think there's lots of stuff all around this.
But the interesting part, as I'm listening to you guys talk about this, is this is just one mechanism. I mean, you listed 8 mechanisms that could affect appetite and affect weight loss as a whole. And to your point, I think it is completely individual. The answer often is it depends, and it's really dependent on your situation and who you are and how you react to things. So it's a trial and error process for most people.
The best exercise, Nathan, is the one you'll do. Right? When you start being active, then we can start talking about what to do in those workouts. But get active first if you can. That's the way.
And that was going to be my summarizing point, is that of all the mechanisms we have, exercise is the cheapest, most effective, well-documented tool in our toolbox as health professionals. So if there's anything you take from this presentation, get moving, I guess is the end message. Along those lines with specific to exercise, there was a question around, is there any research on individuals with heart conditions, heart attacks, bypass surgery? Do you think those individuals should be doing high energy exercises or high intensity?
Yeah. So again, deviating into a HIIT talk. I think, I'm not an MD, I have a PhD, but we've been doing interval training research and I read a lot and I teach about it a lot. I would talk to your physician. That would be the first thing I would do, or your specialist. But I would say the evidence suggests that in many of those scenarios where you think, or people think, that high intensity exercise would be problematic is not true, because you're not doing as much activity. You're doing very short periods of high intensity activity with periods of rest. So again, when you look at data from Scandinavia, from the US, from even Canada, there's lots of different studies showing benefits to many different kinds of cardiovascular compromised individuals. And one that I always show in class, and I love, I'll bring it up here, is that they did it in heart transplant patients, and the recovery from interval training was actually slightly improved over the standard care, which we moderate intensity. So I think with appropriate guidance from your doctors, your healthcare professionals, I think it's something that people could do. I think we just tend to skew away from it. At the end of the day, too, it's not easy, right? So people exercise for a lot of different reasons, or don't exercise for a lot of different reasons, and trying to get somebody to get up and say, go sprint on a treadmill might not be the way to do it. But we are doing all sorts of different kinds of research. I've got collaborators in my department who don't believe in HIIT, and they do the exercise psychology. So we have kind of an adversarial collaboration, whereas I'm a guy who's in my 40s and not clearly as good shape as I could be, because I've got 2 young kids and every excuse under the book. But I do interval training. I run long distances. I resistance train. I play sports. I'm trying to do those things to be active and healthy. But I can see reasons why people don't, or why people shine away. So sometimes it's better to start with something and then tackle the intensity after you get started. I see, Nathan, you probably have way more experience in trying to get people to do this than I do talking to the students who go do this. But
yeah, I mean, a quick note on that is just always break it down to the 2-minute action that you can accomplish without any resistance, right? Like when you're trying to change your behavior, it seems that if you can conceptualize it in a way that seems so easy that you couldn't fail, like I'm just going to literally do 1 minute of squats today, and that's my exercise for the day. What's the resistance to that versus telling someone to get on a treadmill and sprint? That's a much harder question. So, all right. So back to appetite here. We have, can you comment? Actually, no, sorry, Jess, I'm going to throw this to you. For postmenopausal women who want to lose weight, how many of the calories burned in exercise should be put back into the calorie allotment for the day? Thanks.
Another interesting question, kind of going back to what we were already saying. If I'm understanding it correctly, it's essentially like, if you burn X amount of calories, how many should you consume? Again, is that what it should be? I mean, like if the end goal is weight loss, again, like taking into consideration that everything that Tom had already said, and recognizing that it can be a lot more complicated, then ideally it would just be less. That's kind of what you're going for. But again, that has to do with if the end goal is weight loss, it's a very different story than if the end goal is muscle growth, where you tend to need a little bit more. And then you'll see long-term sort of delayed response in terms of weight loss, and with an increased metabolic rate and all that happens with gaining muscle mass. But yeah, I would say like just a general guideline would just be less. Like Tom said, it can be a lot more complicated.
I'm going to add some specifics. So if you know what your energy intake should be based on your body composition or your body weight and your activity level, and there's lots of online calculators that work. If all of you out there want to know a guideline for your resting metabolic rate or the calories you burn lying in bed all day, is just multiply your body weight in kilograms by 24. So on average, we burn about 1 calorie per kilogram per hour. So your 100 kilos, 2,400 calories. That doesn't include the activity you do, the effect of other things. That's just the base. A target, I think, in that specific scenario, not being specific to postmenopausal, because again, not enough done, would be somewhere around 250 calories, I think, is a fair target to try to do a couple days a week, 3 to 5 days a week, that would then drive. The more you restrict, the harder this becomes. So the more you restrict, the less you eat, the more hungry you're going to get. Then you're going to, if you have the willpower not to do it, kudos to you. I don't. But I think there is evidence to suggest somewhere between 200 to 250 calories is a good target for most individuals to target most days of the week. So that's a good. Now, clearly, if you're heavier and you eat more and you're already eating more than you need, technically, then could you curb that back? But I would always start with what should you be eating per day, right? And then I just talked about this morning in class. So,
sorry, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was just going to add again. I get really excited when we talk about this. It's I think too, it'd be really interesting to look at like the psychology behind this, because and look to see like, because I know obviously what Tom said is accurate, and like, but I wonder what that magic number is of how much restriction is too much. Like, I don't know if there is a magic number. I don't know if it's relative depending on the person. It would be a really interesting thing to look at, because at that point too, you're also playing with your mind, because as we were talking about earlier, appetite is not just physiological. And so if you start to restrict so much and you get to a point of literally playing with your mind, then that obviously is just going to lead to a bit of a disaster. So I think, I just had that thought. It'd be interesting to look at.
But this all comes down to the choices you're making. And I think the simple answer is do more activity and do more quality food choices every day. You can have your cheat day. I'm not sitting here. I like my chicken wings after hockey with my buddies and stuff like that. But if you make better choices more frequently, both activity and energy intake, this stuff will come. But I think when you restrict too much, all the stuff that Jesse and I are talking about, there's a dysregulation. And I think, we actually have a paper in submission right now in individuals with obesity, and they don't have an appetite response to exercise. They actually don't respond the same way lean, sedentary individuals do. And that's something we need to follow up. But there's lots that goes into this. And I think those decisions are very difficult, and lifestyle changes are the way to go. But yeah, Jesse, a number is a target, but that's based on my reading and my knowledge. It's not anything that maybe Nathan would target with clients and stuff like that. But being more active and making better food choices will help.
Mm-hmm.
To that point, Tom, I think it's much easier to coach habit-based changes as opposed to the numbers. Don't get caught up with that.
Great.
The number one thing that I've learned through precision nutrition that you shared there is really just bringing to awareness what you are eating and why you're eating it. So just coming into awareness, taking a pause between bites, put your fork down, chew your food slowly, think about, am I actually hungry? Getting more aware of why you eat and the responses that you have to what you eat will go a very long way in how you make decisions in the future. So start with awareness and start with exercise.
And just one quick story, because I 100%. So I gave a talk at a dietetics conference in Philadelphia a few years ago. There was 1,500 dietitians in the room, and it was on exercise and fat loss. And the person that was talking in the session with me was the head nutrition coach for the Winter Olympics in the US. So they were all there to see her. They were not there to see me. But one of the things that we had chatted about, and she had chatted about in her session, was that even with her Olympic athletes, she doesn't have them doing their nutrition recalls or dietary recalls often, right? She does it to get a gauge right? To see like, do you even know how much you're eating and how much more or less do you need to eat or not eat? But then it was more quality decisions daily, like you had said, Nathan. So again, I don't think this is necessarily planning out meals so regimented. If you can do that, awesome. But most people can't. But I think making better food choices is the way to go.
Mm-hmm. So we'll have time for one more, and then we'll get to a more summarized view of the questions at the end. So can you comment on intermittent fasting and exercise? For example, fasting before exercise.
I want to research this very badly, but there is only one of me and only a few students in the lab. We need to get some money to do it. There is lots of evidence, Jesse. I know you want to chime in on this very much. Intermittent fasting is not magic. In a way, if you're exercising towards the end of that fasting period, are there benefits on fat metabolism, fat burning? Yes, there probably is. But at the end of the day, if intermittent fasting is basically going a long period of time without eating and restricting your eating to whether it's 4 or 8 hours or 6 hours or whatever it is, did nothing for me. I don't think I was exercising at the end of the fast, and I don't know if it actually changed. But if it's helping you eat less, then it will work. If it's not helping you eat less and you're making worse choices because you're starving because you know you can only eat for those hours, then it's not effective. So Nathan mentioned it earlier, very individual. I don't think there's anything magic about it. It's not like there's anything, but in terms of appetite, that's a great question. And we don't know the answer. And I'm not aware of any research, Jesse, unless you've come across some.
No, I was just going to make a comment. I think it's just very dependent on what your goal is. Like, and I think it's very individual. Like, from my understanding, yes, like Tom said, there are sort of metabolic benefits, but I don't think performance, from what I know, and somebody can totally debunk that if they need, but I don't think performance improves. And so if you're a performance-based person where you're in the gym and you only get a quality session if you're feeling good about what you're doing, and you are doing fasted cardio and all that jazz, but you're not feeling good and you end up just not giving that much of an output, then how beneficial is that really going to be then? And so I think it's also goal dependent, but it just goes back to the idea that it's extremely individual.
Yeah.
And not enough quality research on intermittent fasting yet, despite the fact that lots of nutrition coaches or lots of fitness coaches are all over it. And I think one big thing, I know we're getting into takeaways here, but it's problematic because I mean, I didn't grow up with a cell phone in my pocket, and many of you probably didn't either, but everybody has a little computer. Everybody has access to information, and most of that information is crap. Right. So you run into so many things, and who do you believe? I hope you trust Jesse and I. I don't think I would speak out of turn because I have a job that I'd like to keep and I don't want to skew you down the wrong road. But there are lots of individuals who use sensationalist information. I mean, see stuff all the time on what exercises to do. It's all crap. What to eat, how not to eat. It's all crap. It's just somebody who thinks they can car salesman you into a hospital. I mean, how many times of fad dieting have there been? Mm-hmm. They all work in the short term. They don't work long term, or we wouldn't have these issues, right? So,
yes, they're a lever you can pull and attempt for yourself and try for your lifestyle and see if it works. But better if you're doing it on the guidance of somebody rather than just taking it at face value of something on the internet. So,
well, and they get somebody who knows what they're talking about too, right?
Yeah. So along those lines, I guess let's summarize here. What daily practical tips would you suggest can help appetite suppression based on your research? If we could package it all in here.
It's a good one. Work harder. I think right now, if you have an issue with your energy intake and eating, those strategies to eat better, to eat less don't work, I would say when you go and be active, be a little more active intense-wise, be more, don't be afraid of intensity. I think what our research suggests that it's more consistent that you will eat less in response or less overall if you do your activity at a higher intensity. Now, granted, you might not be able to do that every day. There's lots of work that I want to do in terms of, can we do this at multiple times a day? You guys may have heard of the term exercise snacks. So there's some evidence that just doing little 1 or 2 minute bouts of activity throughout the day can actually help you handle your blood glucose levels better. And it's called glycemic regulation. So there's evidence of that. We haven't done any of the appetite stuff on that. The other thing might be is do this exercise before you eat your bad meal. I know my bad meal is dinner. So I've often started exercising in the afternoon now. I have the liberty of being able to do that with my job sometimes, and I have a gym in my lab. But try to find strategies that can help you. If you exercise in the middle at night, that's the only time you can do it, then kudos to you, that's it. But if you could then work out in the morning and it would help you with appetite suppression or energy take throughout the day. So there's things about the timing that come in, whether it fits your lifestyle or not becomes the decision. Jesse, anything to add?
Yeah, I was just gonna say, like, something that's been very present in my head recently. I'm coming back to Laurier next year to do more school, which is so exciting. It's so fun. Look at this more. I think for my, because I've been doing a lot of thinking about, how will this help? I think it's important to take note. I think it's important to note how you're feeling. Like if you're in my research, I guess directly, that's like premenopausal, depending on the phase. The other thing is recognizing, one thing that is really important to us and a big reason why we're doing this is if things aren't working for you, then like, that's okay. May mean you need to try something else. A lot of, and I think I mentioned this at one point, a lot of the research that we look at, the reason why we're focusing on females is because a lot of the exercise physiology research is in males. And so if something's not working for you, particularly pre and post menopausal females, then maybe try something else, because what you could be reading about may not, pertain to you biologically. And so, yeah, so that's something that's really pertinent in my head. Feel free to add to that, Tom, if you want.
Well, and I just want to say, females have been not used in research because of the exact complexities that we are trying to tackle, right? Males don't have fluctuations in these hormones that may or may not affect their appetite, where females, it seems, do, and we need to now understand that. But I mean, I can appreciate in the world we live in 2023, that's very different than 1970, 1980, 1990. But these are answers that require complex research designs to answer, and it's difficult work and it costs a lot of money. But there are more people now focusing on female specific physiology than I can ever remember in my career. So I hope that we're on the wave of information, understanding this. And again, the one thing, lots of questions here about postmenopausal, and I mean, I get it. It's a significant life change that males don't go through when you have to deal with menstrual phase, and all of a sudden you don't. And we need to understand both hormone replacement therapy. We need to do a better job of studying that population in terms of what exercise is better for improving body composition and things like that. So hopefully we can tackle some of that in the next few years as well.
That's great, guys. Thank you guys so much for participating in today's inspiring conversation. It was a pleasure speaking with you. If I could summarize the whole thing, I think it'd start with the biggest dominoes first, which it sounds like exercise is going to be our main domino. Think of your basics, like getting enough sleep, getting enough water. Take care of those, figure out what the daily practice looks like. And once you master those, then you can start focusing on tweaking things specific to you. With that, thank you to all who have attended, listened, and posed questions. We'll be sending a link to the recording after this. And please join us for our next inspiring conversation on February 8th, titled The Power of Narratives, Documenting Black and Indigenous Histories in Canada. Thank you all and have a great day.